All right. Good morning. Who saw the best photo in all of sports yesterday? The Flacco Jackson hug. Didn't everyone see that? It was pretty. Yeah, it was one MVP to another MVP. No. Turns out that there is an Usher concert this Sunday. It's kind of the only thing going on, since last weekend. If we can all be somberly watching the concert. But in all seriousness, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Good morning. Another busy week, as they seem to always be. I will say I had a bet with my wife about what the state of the state would be. I thought it would be invigorating. It turns out it was just strong. So Leah won. We had a bet going about where the state of the state would be. It remains strong. So we continue to be, as we heard from the governor. It was an excellent speech. It was very thoughtful. I laid out the 4 core points. I think the governor's been pretty on message about the 4 areas, the 4 pillars of where his administration is focusing. And so enjoyed hearing kind of the path forward. We're going to work, as was mentioned, in partnership. That's another 5 cents to the till. And we'll find a way forward to make sure that all Marylanders have the opportunity to maximize their potential. That's the objective. So I am so pleased today to be here with one of our great Senate leaders, someone who's chairs one of the hardest committees that we have, the hardest issues, the most emotional issues that we face each and every year in the Judicial Proceedings Committee with Chairman Will Smith. And I'll turn it over to him in just a moment. A few things that are coming up for next week and some of the things that we faced this week. We had the bill introduction deadline. So far, we have 1,113 bills in the Senate. The last 8 of those were referred to rules, but just as a comparison, we had about 850 bills at this time last year. And so this is a significant increase. And I know that Judicial Proceedings is feeling it acutely. I know that Triple E is leading the pack. I think they're at about 340 bills right now. And so, as we move forward here, I just think that's going to be a theme that keeps hitting. This is higher than I think we've ever been at this point. And so, as we think about testimony, as we think about the time of bill hearings, next Friday we're going to do this pro forma again, just because committees need more time overall, and I think it will impact the way session functions. Which, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be constrained by time. We would be able to take and receive all the possible perfect information before making decisions. Unfortunately, that's just not what a 90-day session provides. And so we do the best we can with the information we have. But it does mean that some of the ideas that might be great ideas, really thoughtful, we haven't had the chance to really think through the unintended consequences, and they may not get through. And so that's going to be a feature of this upcoming session that really may be in the background. We may not feel it right now, but come 3 or 4 weeks from now, I think when we hit crossover, it's going to be a bit more of a bit more acute. We'll note that we've tried to do the best we can here in the Senate to move bills out as fast as possible, especially those that don't need a lot of work. And so I think we've already moved roughly about 30 bills over into the House. And so we'll keep doing that and keep pushing to the degree that we can, making sure that we've had a chance to be diligent and deliberate fully. A couple of things to highlight. I'll be joining the chairman later today for the Senate Bill 744. This is our juvenile justice improvement bill, looking at ways to improve on some of the reforms that we've passed in the prior year to impact the system, to make sure that we are providing better opportunities for young people when they need accountability for breaking the law, but also making sure that communities feel safe. And there's nothing more important than making sure that we get this right. Do want to highlight Senate Bill 575, also again came out of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. This is the Andrew F. Wilkinson Judicial Security Act, was something that we had passed in the Senate last year. Didn't quite make it across the finish line. A horrific tragedy that happened to Judge Wilkinson, and this is one where, sadly, just as things become more polarized and as guns are more available, there are tragic consequences. And I think that's what we saw here after ruling on a case in juvenile court and custody. It's just a horrific situation. Yesterday, again, and I know that the chairman will go over any details, we had a tough issue around end-of-life options and compassionate care. I'll let Chair Smith talk to that, but I appreciate his leadership and the committee's leadership to navigate a very tough issue. We have President's Day coming up, so we'll have the Lincoln speech, and as well we'll have Senator McCray will be doing the annual presentation of the Washington Day speech in the old Senate chamber in 2 weeks. So we're looking forward to that. I know he is very excited. And then finally, just a quick note, I know that the governor yesterday released his 10-point plan that I haven't had a chance to read in depth yet. Glad to see that we have an outline of where to head, and look forward to seeing and discussing the specifics moving forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the chair of our Judicial Proceedings Committee, Senator Will Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Does he always start off with the dad jokes? I'm a big fan of dad jokes in JPR if you ever watch it, but those are actually worse than mine. So anyway, sorry, Mr. President. We'll all do deference. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Will Smith, chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. The Senate President talked about the volume of work that we've got. We've got over 300 bills in the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which means we are at the beginning of the hard middle. We have hearings, we have work on Mondays, we have formal hearings Tuesdays through Fridays now. We're going to be voting on Friday. But the end result is that we're not going to be able to vote as much, and we're not going to be able to put out as much as we traditionally have, because we will not sacrifice quality and kind of the depth of what we go into the work of producing legislation. So it'll ultimately mean we have a less, I think, coming out of the committee. I do want to highlight some of the, I think, more important and intriguing and interesting issues that are coming out of the committee from some of our members. Obviously, you've heard from our Vice Chair, Jeff Waldstreicher, had End-of-Life Options Act, which the hearing was yesterday, so the committee will start working on that next week. He also has a gun manufacturer liability bill, which would impose liability through the theory of nuisance on gun manufacturers for the violence that potentially is created in the state of Maryland. So that's a novel concept here in Maryland. I think 7 states across the nation have implemented similar measures, so that'll be an interesting issue. Senator James continues her fight against child exploitation on the internet. She's got several bills in that regard, so those are some interesting things coming out. Senator Kelly has a bill that I think we're going to start working on next week, which removes the statute of limitations for sexual extortion and revenge porn. So the law hasn't quite caught up with technology and the internet in that regard, and so we're going to be looking into that next year. Senator Carter continues her work on expanding expungement opportunities, getting the governor out of medical parole, which was an oversight when we got the governor out of the parole process a couple of years ago. So we're going to go back and clean that up. She's also working on expanding opportunities for those with criminal records to serve on juries. And so that bill's come out of the committee a couple of times, so it hasn't cleared both houses yet. And then obviously juvenile justice and juvenile reform continues to be one of the marquee issues coming out of the committee. This week, we heard, obviously we heard the testimony for End-of-Life Options Act and several of the parole bills. Today, as the Senate President mentioned, we're going to be working on the juvenile justice bill. It'll be the first thing we do after voting when we come back from the floor. And with that, Mr. President, I'll turn it back over to you for questions, but that's essentially what's going on in committee, and no shortage of hot issues in the Judicial Proceedings Committee. So that, more dad jokes and commentary.
Certainly. Questions? Yeah, please.
I was at the hearing yesterday, the Aid in Dying Act, and it struck me as those in opposition were a little more organized than those in favor of it. Does that influence the committee at all? Is this going to be different than years past when it comes to getting the legislation to the floor and possibly out of the chamber?
Sure. I'm not sure I agree with that characterization of the proponents and opponents, but look, as always, you hear emotional testimony from the proponents of the bill. They come armed with statistics and information from the states that have implemented this measure, Oregon being the first one, I think over 20 years ago. The proponents and the opponents came in, there were a lot of them. They had more signed up in opposition, which is traditionally the case. So it's not going to teeter on, the level of participation necessarily in terms of in the room. It's going to teeter on the actual constructs of the bill and the guardrails that we were able to erect to put forward something. So it's going to be a close vote. As the Senate President has said on several occasions, it's a vote of conscience. You can't, this is one of those votes that it strikes deep to one's core beliefs and values, and it's just, I'm not sure if data points to the left or the right are going to move someone's vote. As you remember a couple of years ago, that bill prevailed to prevail because of one vote. I've never seen something like that before, and I can only imagine what the person was going through when that happened. So,
what kind of guardrails do you think are the most likely to come or be amended into the bill?
Well, the bill actually is the product of several years of work. So the bill that came out in 2019, I believe, we spent a lot of time erecting some of those guardrails. So in terms of the notification process, you have to have 2 medical professionals. You've got to have a signed attestation. You've got to have a psychologist sign that you are of sound mind. There are lots of procedures in terms of just getting the prescription. You have to self-administer. I mean, I could go on. There are significant guardrails built in, and I'm sure we'll dive into that more, learning from the other states that have enacted it already.
When do you expect to bring that up for a vote?
Not quite sure, but we will get working on it next week.
Could you tell us what is a reasonable number of bills for a committee? I know it may depend on like how big they are, how weighty they are, but like generally, what for any one given committee and then for the Senate?
You know, it's a hard question, and this is something we've been struggling with. We put in a rule about 3 years ago that was a cap of the number of bills per senator per introduction, and so we have it at a cap of 25 bills, and then there's an exception if a member files early, which would be an additional 5 bills. This does not include bills that come as a result of a commission or delegation that may be done on behalf, so an individual can have up to 25. In putting that cap in place, what we noticed was that all of a sudden a number of senators who would have 10 or 12 bills, those bills started to jump up to 20 to 25. And so one of the unintended consequences of putting the cap in, I think, has been that now there is sort of this pressure to get to 25. And so we're thinking of other ways to impact that. The real challenge is that every bill is not the same. You can have a bill that's, as Senator West calls the piffle, that is a technical change, doesn't need any witnesses, you can get done with it within 3 minutes. Or you can have a bill like end-of-life options that's a 4-hour hearing, and you just never know. And so it's difficult to say just the total number. On average, you know, if you think of each bill, each weighty substantive bill being between 15 to 20 minutes, you know, whenever there are 10 or more bills in a hearing day, I generally get worried that it's going to be a long day for the committee. And then the more days that are sort of packed in with those 10 or more bills, you know, just at some point it aggregates. So you can get through it in the first couple weeks, but by the time you hit to week 6, week 7, week 8, it impacts the quality of the work product. And so that's really the big issue. You know, I think if we were around 800 bills by now, that would probably be a little bit more normal. Being at 1,100, it's just it is enormous.
Is there any conversation being had about lowering that cap, or are you thinking about removing the cap altogether?
Certainly not thinking about removing it. I do think we're thinking about lowering it in future years. But also, you know, one of the big challenges is that every bill, we're one of the very, very few states that every single bill that's introduced on time is considered. In most other states, there can be an introduction, but if there's not enough will to have a hearing, there may not be a hearing. I'm not saying we're there yet, but we're close because sort of hearings become a filibuster of kind of voting sessions and markup sessions that are really critical to make sure that the bills are right.
That's more of a legislative practice / legislative courtesy than an actual legal requirement. No, I mean, bills are not required to get hearings.
They're required to be considered. So and the considered is the discretion relies with the chair and the body. And so considered can mean lots of things. We have generally over time made that about a more traditional hearing, but it doesn't require a certain number of witnesses. It doesn't, and you know, the challenge is if you do hearings that are sponsor only with no witnesses, which is a technique that certainly we've had to use many times, it can make people feel like it did not get a full hearing. And so that's always the balance that we're trying to figure out, is how do you make sure that an issue has the ability to be considered, but that if it is considered, it's meaningfully considered.
Mr. President, we're all trying to comprehend the state plan, and you mentioned earlier that you haven't, in my words, combed through it. Based on what you've heard so far, does it need any elements need legislative approval? And the person who's overseeing it, is that a cabinet position that would need to be confirmed?
It's good questions. You know, I don't think it's somebody, I'll start with the second one first. I don't think that that's necessarily a confirmed level position. I think it is about kind of performance management, and that is what the executive administration should be doing on an everyday basis. And so, you know, I would imagine and hope that having a plan with key key performance indicators is something that every secretary is implementing, that is really guiding the cross-sectional work that comes out of the governor's office, and we certainly delegate authority to all governors to have that management style that best suits them. And so, I think that there's some ongoing investigation and review that's hopefully going to be provided. I appreciated a number of the key performance indicators. I'd like to see where we are in Maryland right now, and then what the objectives are, where are we trying to aim with each of those indicators moving forward, and I suspect the administration will move forward with that.
Can this be done through executive policy exclusively?
And I don't even think it needs an executive order. It can be done through a management style. We do have managing for results, which is something that the Department of Budget and Management, through legislative approval, has had for many years. And so I hope that there's an integration of the managing for results with this state plan. We've had that for, I believe we're going on 15 to 20 years. And every year I look at the managing for results report. It's something that really guides where I think about the budget and where we are overall. And so, I think the integration of those two constructs is probably useful.
Chairman Smith, I have a question about the juvenile bill. Now, of course, you're hearing it today, but already we've heard, there's, suffice it to say, a variety of stakeholders with a variety of opinions on what's in the bill. What is your path forward for consideration? Is this on a fast track, or how long, can you explain how JPR is going to consider this bill?
Sure. First, I'd say I do appreciate the coverage and the nuanced coverage of this issue, because it's not something that can be accurately captured in even a news clip on TV or through social media. It's very nuanced and difficult to explain in a short snippet, so I appreciate you all diving in on the details. Look, I've met with the stakeholders. I've gone through line by line with the Office of Public Defender. I've gone by line with the state's attorneys, and line by line with the Department of Juvenile Services. All of the stakeholders have been brought in to offer their opinion on the matter. And if you noticed in the bill file, the majority of the testimony that's been furnished has been favorable with amendments, and some of those amendments are quite good and will be considered by the committee. So you got to start somewhere. I think you hear a lot about data-driven processes, which the JJRA was a product of, and this is a product of data-driven, but also understanding that there are systemic failures. So, for instance, and I wrote this down, if you don't have a paper trail to validate a risk assessment tool, if someone is missing treatment, if departments and agencies aren't talking to each other, that's not going to manifest itself in a grid sheet. But every single component of the process has told us that there's a problem. OPD agrees with that, state attorneys agree with that, and DJS agrees with that. And so what our job is to take those component parts, analyze them, and offer solutions that are narrowly tailored to fit the problem that we all agree exists. I do understand that violent crime, juveniles make less than 10% of violent crime. And that's why I talk about the nuance of the issue and your role in that. I really do appreciate that. But it is a significant crime. It is a significant problem, rather. So we're going to take a deliberative approach and a collaborative approach to produce a quality product that addresses the significant issue before us.
What are some of the issues that, considering this deluge of legislation coming in, what do you think is going to be left behind?
It's hard to say right now. I mean, I think it's a lot of the technical stuff that I worry about that could get lost. That's, it's not urgent, it's not a crisis, it's not something that has an immediate impact. But there's stuff that I think is so critically important, things like apprenticeships, that really need thoughtful consideration about how do we expand our apprenticeship numbers. I don't think we'll leave it behind. I just wish that we had more time to spend on some of these issues that I know they're not explosive, they're not leading the headlines, but they do really matter for the long-term future of the state. And so we're trying to make sure that we keep those in the mix in the midst of trying to deal with everything that's urgent.
You mentioned apprenticeship programs. Anything else that comes to mind initially?
Not off the top of my head. It'll depend. I don't know if there's anything that jumps off, any issues that are specific that may get left behind. I think it's too early to say. I don't want to foreclose that we can't. We have great chairs that know how to manage a lot of work, but I just do worry that if we don't have enough time, by the time we get to crossover, there's just stuff that, if it's not urgent and burning, it may have to take another year.
Sure. And then Chairman Smith, just going back briefly to the juvenile crime, but what have been the sticking points when you're sitting down with these various stakeholders, you're saying?
I remember when we first introduced the bill, I talked about the premise of the juvenile justice system is obviously accountability, but rehabilitation, with a heavy emphasis on rehabilitation. So rehabilitation is gonna be the key component of that. But if there's not enough time or availability of services, if those services aren't evidence-based, then you have to understand that we need more time for that youth to be under supervision. So the probation lengths, that's one point that I think needs to be addressed and has to be adjusted and is a sticking point because we want to make sure that folks get into the services. And the jurisdiction for some of those crimes, so for the guns and cars, right? There are significant spikes in auto thefts, carjackings, and handgun-related crimes. Those are sticking points. Those have to be addressed, and it's to ensure that those youth have access to the services and the supports that they need. Understanding that this is all discretionary. Just because you're expanding jurisdiction doesn't mean that someone has to be detained, that they have to have probation, that they have to be supervised in the community. It's all discretionary, and there are several points of analysis that will go into making that decision for that individual case. So those are two sticking points to make sure that our youths have the supports that they need and that there's a level of accountability, and obviously that there's going to be an element of the critical element of public safety.
Based on the conversations you've had, is there some kind of deviation that you, from the original proposal that you see the committee going right
I think
now?
those will be born out of the discussions that we have in committee.
Anything else?
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
I do have better dad jokes though.